Hey everyone, or I like to say y'all here, because obviously I'm from across the pond. It's my most favorite American saying. So I'm here today to talk about the one thing that everybody hates on the internet, and that is consent banners, cookie banners. So let's start with a common situation that most developers feel almost every single time we're putting a website into production. We tell the team, hey, the website is ready to go. We've ran the Lighthouse scores, and they are green, green, green. Success. And then the marketing team comes along and says, you know, we just need to add a few scripts. And then the lawyers come around and say, you need to remember that you need to put the cookie policy and the privacy policy and the consent banners. So you do all of them things, and then the whole website's performance is broken. And this is something that is so common for all of us. And the marketing team will say, well, we need them to do our job. And the lawyers will say, we don't want to get sued. So why do we have to sacrifice compliance for performance? And I think that when we think about the European Union and around Europe, you know, we've got this really big problem. So let's just get rid of that. Just accept all, as we all do. And one of the biggest questions that always comes up, and back to the Lighthouse scores, is we see how it affects our numbers from greens to reds. And it's really hard to tell actually how much these things are impacting our websites, because things like our Lighthouse scores just don't say it. So what happens if we could actually benchmark these consent banners, the marketing scripts, to find out how much they're actually affecting our production websites? So I created a tool called CookieBench. Cookie banners, benchmark, bang it together, we get CookieBench. And it was made to showcase the performance of all the most popular consent management providers. So if you don't know, a CMP is what the category is around cookie banners. So you can find it on CookieBench.com. And here's actually some of the listings. So what we can see by this is we created a score. So we did all the best-in-class things that we'll speak about today, and we ranked all of these CMPs to work out things like network impact, time to first byte, but most importantly, the banner visibility. How long did it take for that cookie banner to show? If we're based in the European Union, every time you go on a new website, you look at your phone and you pause and wait, and then it pops up. Something that we've all felt. So some of the most important providers and some of the biggest providers that most enterprises are using, most of the biggest Next.js websites in the world are using, are slowing down the website. A 514 millisecond delay is terrible. So no matter how much we try and perfect the performance of using caches and all of this exciting Next.js React Server components, the marketing scripts will always ruin it, and the consent banners. So I started to notice patterns as I was benchmarking all of these tools between all the consent banners, is that they've got terrible dashboards that haven't even heard of things like Bootstrap, let alone ShadCN. All of them use script tags that sit on the header. Do I inline it? Do I critical it? Do I put a critical flag on it? It's never clear, never implementing well with the modern tools that we use every day. But my favorite is no developer needed. All the big platforms are like, we do not need you to have the developer. You don't need to speak to the developer. We're marketers, we're lawyers. So I set out, when I created consent, to really redefine what I thought consent management was. And I was frustrated by all of the tooling out there never being quite good enough, never having React components or hooks or APIs. So I took all the best-in-class learnings from people like Vercel, Clerk, Resend, and I created c15t. What is c15t? Is that it's a brand new standard for the web, mobile apps, TVs, and even agentic flows that takes consent management, takes all the middle layers out, and creates c15t. Very much like we have I18N, A11Y, accessibility. So I really wanted to create this new open source standard that everybody could use to finally fix consent banners for everybody. So it's on GitHub, and we're currently at 1,300 GitHub stars. I think it was this morning we hit there. So you can find it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So let's actually explain what it is and why a developer will think, hey, I could vibe code this in 10 minutes. This isn't a hard thing to do, but actually there's so many complications to it. So I thought about, how do I explain this to people? How do I explain that, consent banners actually need two sides? First, the client, and the second being a server. So I created this Lego block system. So let's see how it works at explaining it to you all. So first, we're going to start with the consent banner, something that everybody knows. Here we go. And you may notice that it already looks slightly different to the consent banners that you're used to on the web. You're used to accept all being the main button. But the thing is, regulations are always changing. And as a developer, you don't have time to know which one you should use. So c15t has all of the best-in-class components to just do it right, as high-level abstraction as possible. This doesn't actually have any coding showing it, but this is like a simple JSX component. And what's really interesting about this is maybe you don't want to use our default blue, and you want to make it match your website. And this was also one of these core pillars when I was creating c15t that I felt like every solution sucked on. I wanted them to handle the logic, but I wanted to make it feel like my brand. So I wanted to, in this use case, remove the rounding on the corners, make it yellow, add my own font face. But what happens if you wanted to completely customize it and go further? So instead of using our best-in-class components, you can opt for a headless mode and even bring your own components or use something like shadcn. And this is another example. So that's consent banners, styling, and then one of the next fundamental pillars is I18N. So when we think about consent banners, we think about the English web. But in the EU alone, there's 24 native languages, 24 languages that you need to support to, handle things like GDPR. So things like internationalization is built in. For example, in the UK, you will see English. In places like Italy, you'll see Italian, and even French. So that is styling, the consent banner, I18N, and you think, that's it done, right? But something that a lot of developers also forget about is that you need to also build in a consent manager to allow your users to change the consent on a fine-grained permission. So for example, when you click customize, you'll see the consent manager, and it will show all the categories that are currently active on the website and allow the user to, sure, accept all, but in most cases, less. So this is taking all of these best-in-class components, and these two are the main and critical ones that most people will know and need. But the other things that are important is things like frames. So this is a new component that we added just 2-3 weeks ago. And this is to also wrap all of the things like your iframes. So if you're a CMS or an e-commerce website, you need to put them YouTube videos in frames. So that cookies, that third-party data, cannot leak until consent is given. And what we have to remember here as well is that everybody, depending on their region, will get different results. So in places like the US, you won't see the frame, but in places like the European Union, you will. And obviously, when we click that, we get a little video. So one of the really big final things is that it's great to provide components, and we've already spoken about the headless mode, and I really set out to make C15T as customizable as possible, no matter if it was server-side rendering, client-side rendering. But one of the most important things was the hook system. And one of my favorite hooks that, if I had to pick one to display, is the has capability. So during things like our dashboards or our marketing websites, we need to conditionally render scripts or maybe components, depending on if marketing has been given consent or analytics. You may even want to go more spicy and go marketing and analytics, or a really complicated statement. And what's really interesting about things like this API is, right now, we're just using things like GDPR categories. But C15T is built to be an agnostic consent engine. So you could quite easily be saying has cloud access or has bank account access. We're just currently using it for the GDPR categories, and we'll be expanding out soon around this area. So that's a quick overview of why just building a client-side consent banner is more complicated than you think. But obviously, we had the other side, that's the server. And now this one was really hard to visualize when I had to make this block system. So let's give it a go. So one of the most important things for a consent banner is geolocation. And this affects not only Europe, but also Americas. And why? Because in places like Germany, you should see a cookie banner. In places like the UK, you should see a cookie banner. But then the US, no. C15T is intelligent to only show the cookie banners and consent banners where they are needed. And that has a two-tone effect, as in, one, people in places like California, where we are now, cannot sue you for having a cookie banner, and that has came across our desk already. But secondly, even though the consent banner is not being shown, C15T is still running in the background intelligently, activating all the things to handle them consents. So again, in the US, if the website uses C15T, you should never see another consent banner. Even places like Australia and the Netherlands, you will. So what is next is I18N. And we've already spoken about I18N on the client side. But again, one of the biggest things about C15T is really pushing the edge on performance. If this is something we all have to do, why can't it be a Ferrari? Why can't it be as best as possible? So if you think back to what I said earlier, there's 24 native languages inside the EU. So that would mean bundling 24 languages. So part of C15T is server-side rendering them. But it comes at a catch. And a lot of other CMPs get this wrong. So let's explain why. So if the device is in Germany and the language is also German, then you should see a German cookie banner. But if the device is in Germany, but say the language or the website is in English, then you should see an English cookie banner. And a lot of the current solutions get that wrong. So that's I18N and server-side languages. But what else is really important? So why even have a server? Is because to do things like GDPR correctly, or even other regulations, you need to store the consent in a database. So when we was building C15t, we said, hey, why don't we support Postgres? But also, why not MySQL? And then SQLite, and then Mongo, and CockroachDB, and hey, why not stick Microsoft SQL in there as well? And the other thing is, we're supporting all these databases, so how are you actually going to get access to that consent data, no matter if it's GDPR or for agentic flows, like accessing consent? Is using things like an ORM. So in terms of ORMs, we support Drizzle, also Prisma, Type ORM, and also Keithly, the whole package. So that was really impressive to build out and get working. But the really big thing as well is maybe you don't have access to the database. You don't have access to the ORM. So we still wanted to think about every layer so important, and think about the composability. What about if you can't use our best-in-class JavaScript components? What happens if it's a PHP website or a Ruby website? So we support things like OpenAPI, so you can easily access every API functionality. But the biggest thing that we're also building out is things like Node SDKs and other frameworks as well. And this is really important for things like then agentic flows. So not only can you save the consent to the database to say, hey, in this example, we're using consent banners, but it could be something like agentic flows, it could be bank accounts, so much more. You can also retrieve it through a type-safe SDK. So that is a really quick tour of the client side and the server side, and why it's so much more complicated than a 5-minute vibe coding job, and why you should use something like C15t that we have built to be an open web standard. So how do we build it to be an open web standard is that you can self-host C15t, the front end and the back end. And one of the most powerful reasons to self-host C15t's back end is for data residency. So people like banks or specific European countries where they're very restrictive of where their data is actually saved can actually host it themselves. And to be a web standard, it should all be open source. So that's self-hosting, but I'm here to also, as the founder of Consent. So what actually is Consent is that it is a hosting platform for C15t. So we really think about this in a way of, if it's something purely for a developer, then it goes into C15t. But if it's something for your legal departments or your marketing departments, that's where you really need a full observability in a dashboard where you can spin it up, where you can say, here, I've implemented it from the developer side, now you can hand it off. So that is where we set up Consent. So that's really cool, and I always want to do one of these things like one more thing that I wanted to cover. And this is a brand new component inside the Next.js package, and it's client-side for a reason. And we always thought, back to the start of the slides, of we've handled the consent management, we've handled things like showing the consent banners, but also what about the marketing scripts? So we built a type-safe system for marketing scripts. Things like your Google Tag Manager, as we can see. It should be simple, easy, and type-safe. So we call this C15t scripts, and C15t is built to be very composable, as small a bundle size as possible. So what kind of integrations have we already built? Things like PostHog, Metapixel, Google Tag Manager, Analytics, Xpixel, LinkedIn, and even things like TikTok and Microsoft UET. This is a really important step for Consent and C15t because we're trying to say, hey, let's normalize all of these different marketing scripts into a new type-safe system that a developer can simply implement once. The consent and the categories are automatically defined to really stop that performance lags that we see. So, when we talk about them performance lags, Guillermo asked me many times, how fast is c15t? So, back to our benchmark. And c15t is incredibly fast with an 89 millisecond banner visibility. And when we set out our scoring system that has all the best-in-class accessibility, also best practices like we spoke about with geolocation, I18N, we also crush it on the scores. So, what does that actually mean? Thank you. So, what does that actually mean to the industry leader? It's quite a lot, as you can see. And to really say again, 89 milliseconds, that is at the price of being dynamic. So 89 milliseconds for showing a cookie banner in the EU or the US, you won't even see one. Incredibly fast. And that's 7.9 times faster than the slowest consent banner that we benchmark. And 1.9 times faster than any other benchmark banner that we put on there. So c15t is bundled by default. And one of the big reasons it can be so fast is also that it's got 0 third-party requests. When it's loading onto your client, it is bundled versus all of these other CMPs that will start a waterfall effect. So if you're on a slow connection, expect them load times to be even slower. The average is 5.6 out of all the ones that we have benchmarked. So, that's c15t, and yeah, we're growing really, really fast. And you can find c15t at c15t.com. But one of the also really exciting things is if you've got a Next.js project, a React project, you can put into your terminal npx at c15t CLI, and within 5 minutes, all of them cookie banners, GDPR things will automatically be set up in your Next.js application. So there's a last few things I want to cover just to wrap it all up. So we've talked about the technology, but some of the most important things here, and the reason we create c15t, is we don't teach the regulations. We teach the abstractions. As a developer, you shouldn't need to know the difference between GDPR, CCPA. You should only need to know the abstraction, things like the consent banner. And why is that? It's because regulations are always changing globally. And how are you meant to keep up to date with that? You're just a developer. You have so many more things to do with your time. And that's why we shouldn't let regulation slow down our innovation. We should use these tools to help increase that. So the hosting platform of c15t consent is growing really, really fast. And week on week, we've had some amazing companies joining us. And we really can't wait to keep on growing. Excited to have everyone and really show off how good this can be. So my real final slide is I fight for the users. And this is something that the whole presentation is not speaking about. It's not speaking about the developer. Well, the presentation is speaking about the developer or the marketing or the legal. But the most critical thing is the users, is all of us who have to use the web every single day. Or when we think about future agentic flows and how consent is given, it is really important that we actually think about how these tools we're using affects the users. And that is why I set it as my goal with c15t to create a new standard. And obviously, that's from Tron, if you didn't know. So just a quick roundup of links. So you can find c15t at c15t.com. All of the benchmarks, and there's so much more that we could have spoke about around the benchmarks, from waterfalls to the tests that we run at CookieBench.com. And to get started really fast with c15t is consent.io. Thank you so much for your time today. And we just really want to make the web better for everybody. And you can find me on places like Twitter, LinkedIn, but most important, starring us on GitHub is one of the most incredible things to really show people why this is important. Thank you so much for your time.